Story 1. My 4-year-old daughter says that before she was born, she was a ghost. When she was a ghost, she would spy on us because she could not wait to be alive and living with us. Story 2. We had just moved into an old farmhouse when one night my 3-year-old, at the time, pointed at the glass door and asked why the other mommy was there. I looked and couldn't see anything and asked what she looked like. My 3-year-old proceeded to explain that the other mommy was dirty and muddy, had blue lips, and blonde hair. I kind of froze because we were home alone together. I said, "Oh, okay, that's interesting." And he said, "Yes, she lives underground. She said she had a good boy like me once." It made my stomach drop, and I took him to my room and locked the door. Story 3. My little sister used to say, "Sometimes at night, a man comes into my room and tries to eat me." She would wake up in cold sweats and sleep in my room almost every night. It got so bad that we had to take her to a therapist. It turns out our stepfather used to come into her room at night and touch her. I am not sure if this counts as creepy, but it was scary to me. She is currently in trauma therapy, and my stepfather is no longer in the picture. Story 4. I am not scared of the thing under my bed. The thing under the bed is my friend. On further questioning, the thing under his bed was our border collie, who sometimes naps there. Story 5. A 5-year-old once said to me with a great deal of sympathy, "A long time ago, I used to be just like you." Story 6. I am starting to forget the names of the people who live in my head. Story 7. My niece was talking to her imaginary friends in the back of the car. She said it was a boy and girl about her age and they were brother and sister. Then, as we came near the end of a road, she said, "This is their home. Can we drop them off here?" My sister and I laughed about it until we reached the end of the road, and it was a cemetery. She gave a little wave and said goodbye as we passed. Story 8. A 6-year-old I worked with about 6 months ago said, "It's Corey. Hi, Corey," to an empty corner. Corey is my grandma's name. She died in 2020. I pulled up a picture of her and asked who it was. He said, "Her name is Corey." Story 9. Not sure if this counts, but when I was 8, I had a new babysitter who was a teenager. Right after my parents left, she asked me in a pleasant tone, "All right, unicorn puppy, where's the stuff your father drinks before he hits your mother?" I come from a stable household with 2 parents who had a good marriage. I was confused and said, "I don't know. My dad doesn't hit my mom." She fell silent. For the rest of the night, until my parents returned, she was awkwardly quiet. I never saw her again. It is only recently that I remembered this and realized what was going on in her life. I feel bad that I took my stable childhood and the love of 2 parents for granted. Story 10. When I was 4, I had an imaginary friend named Billy. Sometimes his friend Lady was with him. Billy went everywhere with me. He had a spot at the table, sat on the swing next to me at the park, and slept on the top bunk. I was really afraid of milk tankers and would shake and cry whenever I saw one. When I saw an ambulance, I would say, "Mom, Billy died in there." We moved to a small town to be closer to my grandparents. My mom started doing family history research and found an uncle named Billy who died in an ambulance after colliding with a milk tanker. His wife, whose nickname was Lady, was with him. 2 of their 3 children were in the car. Unfortunately, no one survived. The small town we had just moved to was near the place where the accident happened, about 15 years before I was born. Story 11. When my niece was about 3, she told her mother that she liked her much better than her other mother because her other mother was mean. And one day she held my head under the water for too long. The same niece, aged around 6, told me that her creepily named dolls were made of blood, bones, and mud. But watch out. Don't let them touch you because they'll turn you into a doll. I turned away from the dolls, and she said to something behind me, "No, Ethel, I told you, do not touch her. She is the best." Story 12. I used to be a police officer, but then I died. I was trying to stop a burglary, and the burglars were very rough with me. Then I died. This was a 4-year-old I used to babysit. Story 13. Meeting my niece for the first time. She stared me down and tried with all her 6-year-old might to break my finger in half, clenching and wrenching, screaming like a weightlifter possessed. She suddenly stopped, unblinking, and said, "I promise there's a good person trapped inside of me." I am glad to report that she did not turn out to be a psychopath, but in the back of my mind, I always think, not a psychopath yet. Story 14. My 2-year-old saw me organizing my basketball cards. He tottered over and said, "When I am big, I will buy those for you." My father bought me those cards 25 years ago, shortly before he passed away. Story 15. We were at a family gathering and my then 4-year-old daughter did not want to leave. She kept repeating, "But it's the last time we will all be together," as we had to literally carry her out while managing our other children. We were at a beloved aunt's home, who suddenly passed away 2 weeks later. It was indeed the last time we were all together. What I wouldn't give to have listened to my daughter in that moment and stayed longer at my aunt's house. Story 16. My daughter offered me what she called diet tea and night-night shots. She was probably around 3 years old. Story 17. My friend's daughter, age 6, said to her little brother, age 4, "I want to peel your face like an orange." Story 18. Once my son looked at me and said, "Oh, you're having a baby." I had just found out I was expecting and hadn't told anyone. I asked him why he said that, and he just shrugged and said, "Just a feeling." I miscarried less than a week later, and he looked at me randomly and said, "Oh, no more baby." The pregnancy and miscarriage had never been discussed around or with him. It was very strange. Story 19. My brother's friend was a teacher in a very rural Australian school, and her class was made up of Indigenous Aboriginal children. When the lunch bell rang, the children would rush to play on the oval. One day, the lunch bell rang, but all the children just sat still. She asked, "Aren't you going outside to play on the oval?" One of the children replied, "No, miss, the tall men are there." She looked but did not see anything and said so. Another child said, "She can't see them. She's a white person. They would not go outside." Story 20. Mommy, you're in a bubble and floating away. I was already dealing with postpartum depression. When my 2-year-old said this to me repeatedly for weeks, I started to think I was going insane. Story 21. I moved from Maine to Texas to live with my brother, who was in the United States Air Force. We had no family or friends in Texas, so I did not know a single soul. While working at Walmart in Fort Worth, an unknown child came up to me and said, "I know you." I replied, "That must be a mistake. I'm not from here." The child said he remembered seeing me eating at a unique local restaurant from my hometown in Maine last year. It was a strange experience. I still never figured out who he was. He must have been about 11 or 12 years old. Story 22. When I was a toddler, my family said that any time they held me in their arms, I would start whispering in their ear, "Behind you." My mom thought it was funny, but it scared my siblings and aunt. Story 23. My little cousin, about 3 years old, looked at us all at the family gathering and said, "You know, I went down with the ship." Then he switched back to 3-year-old English and started playing. Story 24. Mommy, can we sleep with the television on? I don't want the adults to watch us sleep again. The night before, I had a terrible nightmare that aliens were watching us sleep. It was almost like an out-of-body experience because I could see us in bed and my bedroom exactly how I left it that night. At first, I didn't think anything of it until she said that, and then I realized maybe it wasn't a dream. She was only 2 at the time. Story 25. My daughter, who was around 3 years old at the time, was in bed. She giggled and then asked if I had tickled her feet. No, I had not. Story 26. I don't like it here, Mommy. I want to go back to the planet I came from. My 3-year-old says this to me with a big sigh. Story 27. My niece had never met my father, her grandfather, as he had passed away the year before she was born. When she was 3 years old, she pointed at the corner where his walking stick used to sit, waved, and said, "Hiya, Granddad," with the biggest smile on her face. It was the creepiest and sweetest thing I had ever seen. Story 28. My half-brother has a very particular name. His father had an older brother who died at a very young age with the same name. My brother was named after him. When my brother was 3 or 4 years old, he looked straight into his dad's eyes and said, "Daddy, do you remember when I was older than you and we played together? Then I fell asleep and now I'm younger?" Story 29. My child was maybe 2 or 3 years old, mostly nonverbal at the time. He was a very late bloomer. Anyway, he was having a very animated conversation in his bedroom. I asked what was going on, and he said he was talking to his ghost friend. I was skeptical but had no idea where he would have heard that. Years later, his older sister claimed there was a ghost or weird happenings at that same house. I'm not sure what to think. Still creeps me out. Story 30. Not sure if this counts, but I was about 8 or 9 and had a feeling our family dog was going to die that night. I told my family, and they thought I was just being a kid. That night, our dog passed away in his sleep. I had a really strong bond with that dog. I used to talk to him every day, and he was my therapist when my parents abused me or fought loudly with each other. Since he passed, I haven't been mentally the same and have been in a chronic state of depression. I'm 34 now, and it is still there. Story 31. A friend used to babysit a child who would aggressively rock on the rocking horse while staring at her and saying, "I hate you. I hate you." Story 32. A little girl walked up to us at the airport and said, "Don't get on the plane." I looked at my wife and we were both confused. I turned back to ask where her parents were, but she was already lost in the crowd. This was the only time I have been freaked out on a flight. My wife was totally out of it because of Valium, which she takes to help with flying. Story 33. One day, my little son, in his cute Thomas the Tank Engine pajamas, came into the kitchen at breakfast time and told me, "The sanctity of this place has been fouled." Story 34. When my son was in kindergarten, we were sitting in the living room watching television together when he said, "Mommy, Bob is watching you." Bob was the imaginary poltergeist I was terrified of as a kid that I never told anyone about. Story 35. I have 3 children. 1 girl, the eldest, and 2 boys. When my daughter was about 4, she often talked about how she had been here before with her little sister. At that time, she was an only child. She said they both drowned, and she was glad to be here now but missed her sister. It was a little creepy, but kids are strange, and she grew out of it by the time she was 6. She did not remember talking about it when she was 10. Several years later, when my daughter was around 12 and her second little brother was about 4 years old, he suddenly said, "Mommy, remember last time when I was a girl? Me and Big Sister were on the boat. I went under the water and died, and Big Sister did too." Story 36. A client's 5-year-old asked me how old I was. I said, "Actually, my birthday is next week. I'm going to be 34. She looked at me with an absolutely blank face and deadpan said, "Oh wow, another year. Maybe." Story 37. When I was around 20 or 21, I would often go to my friend Stephanie's house. Her little sister Katie, about 6 years old, would often be playing in the other room. One day, I went over, and Katie was playing with one of her Barbie dolls. Stephanie and I started playing Dr. Mario, which was a household staple at her place. Her mom was very good at it. After a few minutes, Katie came over to us and asked if we were going to play for much longer because she wanted me to play with her. Stephanie told her that we would be playing for a while. Katie looked at me and said, "Let me know when you are done because she is just going to stare at you until you come play with us." Stephanie and I were like, "What? Who?" Katie walked away and said, "Just hurry up and play with me." To this day, Katie insists that she has no idea what we are talking about, but we know what we heard. It still gives me chills. Story 38. I am not religious, so it really surprised me when my son was 2.5 years old and told me, "Before I was born, your grandfather used to take me to the park. He then explained that this was before I was in your belly. My grandfather died over a year before my son was born. He always took us to the park when we were children." Story 39. Not sure if this is creepy, but it was very strange at the time. When I was pregnant with my second child, my son and I were driving in my car. I remembered reading a book from years ago that suggested children can have incredibly early memories. We just do not always ask them. My son was almost 3. I asked him, What is the very first thing you ever remember happening in your life? He thought about it for a second and then started yelling, push, push, push. I was so stunned I had to pull over. Whether it was real for him or not, I have no idea. But it really happened, and that is what he would have heard. Story 40. At the time, I was a single mother with one child. We had just moved into a surprisingly cheap rental house. On the third night there, my 4-year-old daughter told me her sister was very mad at us, although she was an only child at that point. 2 nights later, she came running into my bedroom crying because her sister was giggling in a really scary way. I let her sleep with me, but the next morning, when we went into her room so she could change, she asked me if it was normal for there to be so much blood on the walls. I packed our stuff in the car and moved out on our 6th day there. I had no one else to turn to except my brother, with whom I had a very poor relationship at the time, but I called and asked for help. He was very surprised when he found out it was not just a relapse and offered to go back a couple of days later with a friend to get the rest of our belongings. He said the landlord was upset we moved so quickly but had been having problems keeping tenants for more than a couple of months at a time. His friend told me he offered the landlord to come back in a few nights and burn the place to the ground. Story 41. One day I was taking my dad, a history enthusiast, to a Civil War battlefield, and my 3-year-old came along. It was a beautiful day, and we were staring out into a large field when she said unprovoked, "I'm tired of looking at these bad men doing bad things." Story 42. My daughter, who was 4 at the time, said, "Mummy, what if my dreams are the real life and this is the dream?" Story 43. After learning about the concept of suicide, "Oh good, that means you can make the pain stop whenever you want." Me in 1st grade. I received mandatory counseling because I was being abused at home. Story 44. My little cousin used to talk about the old man in his closet. My aunt was afraid to research the history of her house for a while. It was built in the mid-1990s, and no one had died there as far as she knew. Eventually, my cousin stopped talking about the old man in his closet, so my aunt finally looked into the history of the house and found that nothing had happened there. Still, she has no idea where he got that from. Story 45. Not me, but a friend of mine's son told her that someone brushes his hair back off his forehead just as he is falling asleep. His mother used to do that when he was a baby, but she had been dead for 5 years by the time he mentioned it to her. He was not scared, but comforted. Dreams? Maybe, but the same dream every night? Story 46. My daughter, at about 18 months, was staring at something behind me. When I asked her what she saw, she said, "Nanny," meaning my mother, who died 6 weeks after she was born. When she was old enough to talk, she told me about seeing Nanny while she was in the tub. She said that Nanny would get her some toys to play with. Story 47. My then toddler looked at the rocking chair on my parents' porch, waved at it, said, "Hi, Huey," and went right back to playing. That was my godfather's rocking chair. His name was Hugh. He died almost 10 years before she was born. Story 48. My 2-year-old daughter woke me up crying in the middle of the night. I picked her up out of her crib, and she pointed at the window, saying, "Bad boys and girls." It gave me goosebumps. The way she said it was really creepy. Story 49. When my daughter was 4, we were walking past a restaurant, and a man was standing in front smoking. She stopped, turned to him and said, "You're going to die," in a totally flat voice, then just kept walking. Story 50. Apparently, I used to talk to an old man around 3 or 4 years old on the edge of our property and would tell my parents about it when they got home from work. My mom asked my caregiver if she had ever seen this man I spoke to, and she said no. We all then went to visit my grandmother, who lived far away and whom I had not seen since I was a newborn. We walked inside, and I said, "That's the old man there." It was a picture of my grandparents on their wedding day. My grandfather passed away when my mom was pregnant with me. Story 51. My 2-year-old son was laughing hysterically during his nap. I went to check and he was sound asleep. When he woke up, I asked, "Did you have a good dream?" He said, "Yes, Grandpa took me for ice cream." Grandpa had died 2 weeks before. Story 52. My 2-year-old grandson has been telling his parents that the man visits him in his bedroom at night. A couple of weeks ago, when he was at his grandmother's house, he opened a box of old photos she keeps in her living room and looked through them. He held up one of her father, who died 10 years ago, 8 years before he was born, and said, "Grandma, it's the man." Story 53. When my 2.5-year-old, who has had open heart surgery, told me a story about her travels to the sun with our deceased dog, it kind of made my blood freeze. Story 54. I was helping a man at work, and his child, who had been silent until that moment, looked up at us and said, "None of this is real," then walked away. We both just sat there for a moment after that. Story 55. When I told my little niece, who is 8 years old, that I had to have surgery, she very sweetly told me, "Well, I could just shoot myself again and then go to heaven as an angel and just fix you myself." I insisted that she not do that. Story 56. When my youngest was about 3, on the way to nursery she was telling me all about her grandmother from before who had purple hair and glasses, took her to France, loved living in the area we were in, and asked if I wanted to see where she lived. I said, "Sure." And she walked me down the high street in a direction we hadn't walked before. She was babbling the entire time. She suddenly stopped and got a faraway look in her eye, like she was listening to something or maybe remembering something. Then she looked up at me and said, "She's not here now. Okay, let's go to nursery." We were outside the funeral home. It was so creepy. I got goosebumps all over my body and was freaked out for a long time. I didn't say anything else to her about it. Just walked off to the nursery, but it was very strange. Story 57. My 3-year-old said, "There's something staring at me from the window." I looked out the window and saw nothing. Me, "What did it look like?" 3-year-old, "It has green eyes." I remembered seeing the exact same green-eyed creature many times in my childhood. I never told anyone about it. Something just gave me chills knowing my child was seeing the same thing. Story 58. At his 6-year checkup, the doctor asked my child what his favorite food is, and he said human flesh. Story 59. While bathing our very verbal 22-month-old, he looked us straight in the eyes and said, "Reincarnation." He also talked at length about his friend Wilson while from Wisconsin. We live in Tennessee and have no connection to Wisconsin. He said Wilson helps African American people on his train, and then hides them but not like a game. He was always adamant about the not like a game part. Again, we never used the words African American people in any conversations in the house. We always assumed he had some sort of underground railroad connection. He is 20 now and definitely an old soul. Story 60. I told my mother when I was about 3 that I did not like the lady in the basement, or that she kept trying to make me put my hand in the wall. She asked what lady, and I said from the picture and took her to the basement. Hidden away in a closet were a bunch of old photos and a strange painted portrait, really old-fashioned. The woman was the previous owner of the house, which was not owned by her brother, our landlord. She had died in the basement while trying to do laundry, as she was advanced in age and stubborn about getting help despite her bad health. The portrait was apparently some family tradition. The brother had one too, and so did his parents. Many of her belongings were still in the house we were renting. After we found the portrait, I took my mother to a wall and told her the hole was there. She moved some boxes out of the way and, sure enough, there was a hole about the size of a child's fist on the ground being covered. I still vaguely remember showing her the hole. I also remember seeing the woman wandering around down there in a sort of dreamlike way. A very small woman, her face obscured by wrinkles in a way that is hard to explain because, in retrospect, it did not look natural. To a child, she just had a strange face and wore a white nightgown with little flowers on it. My mother had always been creeped out by the basement, but I played down there until I was no longer allowed. Growing up, I remembered the lady and the hole, but nothing else. My mother never discussed it again. We lived there the rest of the year, then moved as soon as we could because my father did not believe any of it. It was not until I brought up the old lady when we were talking about the house at age 16 that my mother filled in the blanks. This was surprising because I thought the old lady who owned the house would just come over in her nightgown and that she was simply upset about the wall hole. She really wanted me to reach in there. Story 61. When I was a teenager, I used to babysit 3 kids, and the mother was difficult. The youngest would drag out the knife drawer, which was just a large bottom drawer in the kitchen. He would swear and say, "That's a piece of crap," and threaten me by stabbing the knife into the floor and carpet. It was like 3 to 4 hours of sheer terror every time I babysat. Sometimes she would forget to get cash out of the automated teller machine and say, "Can I pay you next time?" I finally had my mother call her and tell her there would not be a next time like an adult. Story 62. 2 stories. The first one is the one my dad told me, where I came up to him randomly and said, "When I was older like you, I got a sunburn and I died. I was maybe 3 or 4 years old." The second one was when I was about 12 or 13 years old. I was playing a random flash game while my little cousins, identical twins about 5 or 6 years old, were over. One of them came up to me and said, "I remember playing a game just like this when I was older." Full circle. Story 63. The Grim Reaper smells like sulfur. My 5-year-old said this after discovering what sulfur smelled like. It was unprompted and so weird. Story 64. My nephew, while chatting with my grandmother about Christmas, suddenly said, "You will be dead then," when she was talking about Christmas. She died on December 20th. She was not even sick at the time. He was 3 years old at the time and does not remember saying it. Story 65. My best friend when I was younger would recount her sexual abuse vividly and almost fondly whenever the topic of that relative came up. We were about 10 years old. Over the next couple of years, she began to romanticize necrophilia and sexually assaulting specific celebrities. Story 66. I babysat a child who was probably 3 or 4 years old. At the park, she collected a dozen or more pill bugs and put them in a cup. She gathered some leaves to feed them and pretended to take care of them. When it was time to leave, I said, "Let's put them back so they can go home and we can go home too." She turned and said, "No, we need to kill them." Then immediately dumped the cup and started stomping on all of them. Most were dead before I could stop her. This behavior was totally out of character for her, and I never quite saw her the same way after that. Story 67. My 4-year-old regularly tells me accurate things about my grandmother, who passed away 3 days after my daughter was born. She has told me about Pooter, which was my grandma's dog when I was a child. The most recent one was, "Do you remember when I was big and I took you to the doctor and then to McDonald's?" Yes, I do. Story 68. My second daughter always insisted she had an imaginary friend. I would hear her genuinely having full conversations. One day, as we were standing in the kitchen, she told me her friend was upstairs in her bedroom. Immediately, I heard small footsteps in the bedroom above us. She said, "See, no one else was home." Story 69. When I moved into my house at 4 years old, our house was haunted. My brother said there was someone behind his door who watched him sleep. My mom told me that when they were asleep, I woke them up and said there was a man standing next to them, just watching them sleep. It was really creepy. Story 70. Asking my 2-year-old daughter why she was scared of her bedroom, she said she was scared of the Harry scream. I was certainly scared of the Harry scream too after that. Story 71. My son used to tie his closet doors closed every night before bed because he believed his grandfather would come out if he didn't. At one point during that time, I was doing a lady's hair. She told me out of the blue that my son locks his closet door at night to keep the demons away. I was shocked. Story 72. Story time. This came from my dad. My parents had a cat that my sisters loved. One night when my folks were going to bed, my dad tried to shoo the cat off the bed. The cat, as my dad described it, had some kind of seizure. Its eyes rolled up in its head. It started convulsing while hissing and spitting. It lost control of its bowel and bladder, and it did not survive the night. My dad found a shoebox and put the recently deceased cat in the box. Then he put the box on the top shelf in the hall closet, intending to bury it the next day. At breakfast, my oldest sister, who was probably 4 or 5, asked where the cat was. My dad said, "She got out last night and we don't know where she is." My other sister, a year younger, calmly stopped eating, looked at my dad and said in a flat tone, No, she's not. She's sleeping in the box you put her in the closet. My dad said she stared at him with a kind of creepy, dead-eyed, accusatory look for a minute, then went back to eating her cereal. It turns out my sister had heard the cat's final commotion, gotten up, and seen my dad put the dead cat in the box and then the closet. Story 73. I don't want to die anymore. He wanted me to switch his Minecraft from survival mode to creative mode. Story 74. When my daughter was a baby, my other son, who was about 3 at the time, was holding her. He looked at me seriously and said, "We don't strangle our baby sister." I replied, "That's right, buddy. We only do nice things to our baby sister." Story 75. A fellow employee told me that her 3-year-old daughter had accidentally squeezed her kitten to death twice. I finally got a chance to speak with the child and mentioned that I had heard about the recent loss. She signaled me to come closer so she could whisper in my ear, "I kill all my pets," then giggled. When I told the mother, she looked frightened and said, "Please don't tell anyone." Story 76. My stepdaughter didn't say anything when she was the creepiest. She wore a white nightgown, about 8 years old, with long dark hair. One night, around midnight, after some time with my wife, I went to the bathroom. I opened the bathroom door and turned on the lights. I saw my stepdaughter standing in the bathtub, but I saw her through the bathroom mirror. She turned to me, stared at me in the mirror, and gave me the biggest sinister grin I have ever seen. Her head was slightly tilted down, so her hair covered her face like the girl from The Grudge. I turned off the lights, closed the door, and walked back to my wife, saying, "What the heck?" I explained to her what I saw, but she refused to handle it. I went back to the bathroom, turned the lights on again, and said, "Her name, go to bed now." She went to bed. I remember this vividly. Took me quite some time to fall asleep that night. Sleepwalking kids are strange. Story 77. Tune of Muffin Man. Do you know the glass man who lives inside your shed? Backstory. The bedroom window looks right at the garage wall. The garage was being redone. With the panels off, the framing revealed the contents of the garage. My son asked to close the glass part of the window. I said, "No, sorry, it's too hot." He said, "Okay, hello, glass man," and proceeded to sing the tune. The way he paused before shed just threw me off. Estimated time of arrival. My son is 3. Story 78. When I was a teenager, I used to babysit a foster child for a local family. She had sadly experienced severe abuse and neglect at the hands of her biological parents and was extremely traumatized. After she fell asleep, I had to stay alert most of the night because she suffered from sleepwalking and night terrors, which I now believe were a form of post-traumatic flashback. Some of the things she would say as she walked around the house in the dark were pretty terrifying. I never knew what to expect. Story 79. My cousin once whispered to me, "You go to sleep and wake up dead." When I asked what he meant, he repeated himself. I started freaking out, and when he saw that, he repeated himself more clearly, "You go to sleep and wake up Jeff. Wiggles, man." Story 80. Dada, I want to cut you open and get inside when it is cold. We watched The Empire Strikes Back, and my son, 5 years old, asked what Han Solo did to the Tauntaun. Story 81. Walk toward the thunder. Let us see what we can see. My best friend said this in his sleep while camping at a lake with a thunderstorm rolling in. We were probably around 12 years old at the time. I am glad I did not foolishly entertain his request. Story 82. Just about to enter the doorway of a house that was for sale and being shown, our toddler said loudly, "I don't like this place. Let's go home." We all heard it, went in, and found the place had a bad feel to it. We later learned about the sad story of the house where the mother died, and the family fell apart in her absence. The children drifted, the father fell off the rails, and they had to sell. Story 83. When I was a child on Halloween, while I was out trick-or-treating, I did not want to leave a particular house and kept knocking until someone came back. At that point, I asked the adult who answered why they did not recognize me because I was the little boy who used to live there. I only vaguely remember going to the house and do not remember any of the rest or what made me do that. I must have been approximately 4 or 5 years old at the time. It still unsettles me about 30 years later if I think about it too much. Story 84. When I grow up, I'm never moving out. Scariest thing my daughter has ever said. Followed closely by, "Can I have your eyes when you're dead, Mom?" Story 85. Shortly after moving into a new house, I was tucking my 5-year-old daughter into bed when she asked, "Daddy, why is the girl in the corner always crying?" Later, upon inspection, I found a water pipe running through her closet. That girl gave me the creeps for the night. Story 86. Roy is here playing with me. Roy was my friend who died 8 hours earlier. Story 87. Not creepy so much as making me emotional. When my little brother was about 4 or 5 years old, he woke up one night and told me and our parents that he was talking to David. When my parents asked him what David looked like, he said he was a little ginger boy about his age who was looking out for us. We all just froze because he had described my best friend who died about 3 years before my brother was born, at the age of 5. That one hit me hard, but in a good way. Story 88. My daughter was 3 years old when she told me that she and her old family died in a house fire. Around that time, she talked a lot about her old family. To this day, she is petrified of any type of fire. She is 9 now. Story 89. When my youngest daughter, who is 27 years old, was 4, she became very sick. She had a fever so high that she experienced a seizure. On the way to the hospital, she said, "The nice lady says it's time to go now, Mama. Back to the guff." And she giggled. I was screaming as I was driving down the interstate, "Forget that lady. You stay here with me." It was the most scared I have ever been. Story 90. "Oh, Kellen has a twin," my niece said with a straight face as she pointed at a gory monster from Resident Evil. I just laughed, thinking it was a joke about her friend. No, Kellen got into an accident a few days earlier and his face caved in. It looks like him. Story 91. There is a witch in my closet. A little context. As a kid, I was scared of the dark because I was convinced there was a witch in my closet. Fast forward to my teenage years, and I experienced something strange. Perhaps psychosis or a hallucination. It was a creepy, half-dead, horror movie-like woman with gangly fingers and stringy hair. One night, it grabbed me. I do not know if it was sleep deprivation, psychosis, or something else. Years later, I am living in the same house. My sister and her daughter move in. She is about 3 years old. We were careful not to talk about monsters in the dark or anything similar. She had never been scared of the dark before. One day, she told us, "There is a witch in my closet." My blood ran cold. My sister and I cleansed the house with sage and made monster spray, using Febreze in a spray bottle for her to use at night. We never worried about it again. I am sure this is all coincidence, but it definitely freaked me out. It made me question whether it was an overactive imagination or a shared experience. Story 92. Funny story. I was home alone when I heard a child by the back door at the kitchen yell, "Come play with me." Looking out the window, I saw no child but again heard a child yelling, "Come play with me." I opened the door and stepped outside, and then I heard a child for the third time, but it came from above. I looked up and 2 things happened. I learned that crows can talk in childlike voices. Now, 22 years later, I still have an intense dislike and prejudice towards crows. Story 93. The murderer used an ice pick. A child walked in on adults discussing a murder in the newspaper. No one knew how the person was killed, but after that was mentioned, it was investigated and the child was correct. What made it even creepier was that the child only said that, "Got a glass of ice water," and then left the room as if it was nothing. Story 94. Has anyone else noticed that most of these happen with 3-year-olds? This might be the cutoff age for memories of a past life. Story 95. I was working at a summer camp and noticed a young child isolated from the group who seemed upset. When I asked if everything was okay, he replied, "God is talking to me." I followed up by asking what God was saying. He looked me dead in the eyes with anguish written all over his face and said, "You really don't want to know." Then he walked away to rejoin the group. Story 96. The child was me. I had a Mickey Mouse Clubhouse playset when I was little. I was 4 or 5 years old when this happened. I was pretending to have a funeral for Goofy because apparently Donald beat him to death. My mom saw this, and the conversation went like this. My mom, what happened? 4-year-old me, Goofy died. My mom, why? 4-year-old me, Donald beat him all up. I still question how I understood the concept of death at that level as a preschool-aged kid. Story 97. My oldest child, who is 11 years old, whispered 2 days to my sister when she was 2 years old. My middle child, who is 9 years old, sleepwalks. A few weeks ago, I was up cleaning the kitchen before bed when she came downstairs and said, "They're everywhere." I don't know what she was dreaming. I just helped her go to the bathroom and got her back into bed. Story 98. I'm glad we did not eat you, after telling me they had never kept a babysitter this long. Story 99. When my son was 3, I pulled him in for a side hug and kissed him on his head. He immediately said, "Don't kiss me, mommy. The man in the kitchen who is black will get angry." Story 100. Back when I was dead, did you know I would be born one day? Story 101. Back in 1983 or so, my 4-year-old little brother suddenly said, "I was black in my last life." Everybody just froze. Story 102. My daughter was talking in her sleep one night. She sat up, looked at me, and started a 10-minute stream of consciousness which began with, "The devil lives beneath my skin." Then she lay down again. It was chilling. Her voice was so calm. She was 6 years old, and it was 13 years ago, but I still remember it so clearly. Story 103. I was in the bathroom with my 2.5-year-old, brushing their teeth, giggling, saying silly words, the normal pre-bedtime shenanigans. They stopped, looked up at the ceiling in awe and said, "Look at all the eyes." No thanks. Story 104. I always thought my daughter was hilarious, but now I think maybe what she said was a little creepy. Around 4 years old or so, she said, "Mom, remember when I was in your belly? I wanted out." She had such a serious look and tone of voice when she said it that I thought she was a comic genius. Story 105. My daughter told us at a very young age, around 4 years old, about these black-eyed children that live in the woods behind our house. She said they cannot come inside unless she invites them. There were also red-eyed children in the woods. Story 106. Look, Mommy, it's the daddy ghost and the baby ghost. My 2.5-year-old son exclaimed excitedly, pointing at nothing visible as I pulled into our garage. He saw the baby ghost a few more times over the next months, once running to get his brother to see. The baby ghost was usually in his room. A father and his young daughter were killed in a house fire in our neighborhood a week or two before he started claiming to see ghosts. The sightings stopped after about 3 months. Story 107. Not me, but when my brother was little, my mom was cooking in the kitchen and he was with her. Suddenly, my brother asked, "Mom, why is that boy crying in the corner?" My mom looked over, but there was no one there. Story 108. I make you naked, little princess. My 3-year-old was peeling the paper off his crayons. Story 109. About 10 years ago, I was studying to become a teacher but never finished. We were preparing a Christmas play at the local church. It was the usual story about the birth of Jesus. I was helping toddlers get into their costumes. They were supposed to wear wings like little angels and start the play by walking in and singing. I was in a damp room in the lower level of the church with about 50 toddlers. Some corners of the room were barely lit. After about 15 minutes of putting wings on hyperactive children, I saw one child standing in a dim corner. I walked up to him and asked, "Hey Kevin, what are you up to? We have to go in a couple of minutes." He just stared at the wall and said, "Oh, I am just thinking about my sins with this bearded man." There was no bearded man there. I was the only adult who had entered the room that evening. The strange thing was I didn't help Kevin with his wings, but he had them on. They were fastened with safety pins, and there was no way a toddler would be able to do that. Kevin said the bearded man helped him with his wings, but only if he shared his sins with him. Story 110. A child screamed at me, "I'm going to stab you in the gut." I was babysitting 2 children whom I regularly watched, plus their 7, or 8-year-old cousin whom I had never met before. The cousin started throwing food while we ate dinner. I asked him to stop, but he did not. I gave him another warning, which he ignored. I told him to go to his room until he was ready to eat his food and not throw it. He screamed that he was going to stab me as he walked away. Story 111. When I was a child, I told my mother, I want to be buried here. As we were driving past a beautiful, beloved cemetery. I'm not sure why I said that. Story 112. My daughter had an imaginary friend when she was little. It was very normal but quite creepy, especially if you have watched a lot of horror films. My friend's little boy used to see a ghost of an old man in their apartment. The adults never saw anything but definitely felt something odd about the place. They did not stay there very long. Story 113. Years ago, for one of my friend's little sister's birthdays, I dressed up as a clown on their jumping castle with the 6-year-olds. One of them kept hugging my arm and was very aggressive, saying, "If you go inside, I'll stab you." Story 114. There is a man outside the window. We are on the 14th floor. Story 115. My parents said that when I was a child, we would go to a restaurant located in a very old building in town, dating back to the early 1800s. They said I would talk to what seemed like nothing in the corner. When they asked who I was talking to, I would say, "The nice man. Don't you see him?" Story 116. When my son was about 3 years old, he woke up screaming like we had never heard before. It was around 10 o'clock in the evening, and when we went into his room, his eyes were wide open, and he described a scary owl with dead eyes and one wing on fire sitting on his dresser. It took well over an hour to calm him, and he slept in our room for a week. Story 117. My daughter used to stare out the window and wave as if someone was waving back. I asked her once who she was waving to, and she said, "The werewolf." I asked her where it was, and she said, "Right there," pointing at an empty spot in the front yard. Story 118. Sparring at karate, a 10-year-old girl said she was going to kick me, a 45-year-old man, in the head and give me brain damage. Story 119. My middle child, who is 3 years old, has regularly asked me over the last year where her other mother is. She tells me that I was dead, that she had another mother, and that she does not know where she is gone. It gives me the creeps. Story 120. My child used to talk about the people who came into their bedroom at night. The 3rd floor, basically the 4th floor, so nobody was breaking in. My other child talked about the TV show that appeared on the door to an old dumbwaiter in his bedroom. They would both laugh enough to wake me up, and I would check on them to see what they were doing. They told me how funny the people or the show was. One of them talked about how much they missed these people years after we had moved. They were 2 and 3 years old when it happened. Story 121. When my son was 6, he used to have major night terrors. He would wake up crying and afraid, saying he was lost. You were not supposed to wake them up, but I would sometimes be able to pull him out of the night terrors by talking about something we had discussed earlier in the day to get him back to reality. One night, I woke up to him having a night terror, rushed to his side and started talking about our favorite colors, which we had been discussing earlier that day. During night terrors, his eyes would be open, but he could not see what was in front of him. He would look through me. "Remember, you told me your favorite color is green," I reminded him gently. He turned to me, his eyes open, seemingly looking right at me. "No, it's black." Story 122. My niece, who is 3 years old, saw a picture of our deceased grandmother. She never met her because she died long before my niece was born. My grandmother was about 65 years old in the picture. My niece grabbed it, stared at it, and said, "Look, Mommy, it's me." My sister replied, "No, baby, that's Papa's mom." My niece said, "Yeah, but Mommy, that was me once, and now I'm here." Story 123. One afternoon, my little brother walked into the living room where everyone was sitting, crawled into my mother's lap, and said, "Make Carson stop coming into my room. It's not fun anymore." My mom asked, "Honey, who is Carson?" "He says he is Grandpa Louie's true love." At this, my grandmother gasped audibly and started questioning my 6-year-old brother. According to him, Carson was a man like Daddy, but pretty like mommy, and he has a yellow necktie with big horses. Apparently, Carson asked my brother to find out where our grandfather was buried. My grandmother became very upset. I guess Carson was the watch repairman in my grandparents' jewelry store. I never heard anything more about it from that day on. It was creepy and taboo to discuss. Thanks a bunch for sticking around till the end of the video. Remember to subscribe, and until next time, stay awesome and goodbye.